The Cold Steel Laredo is one of those amazing models that really deserves to have several market offerings as it relates to market segmentation. Some materials, just like this pre-GSM Cold Steel Laredo made of SK-5 steel with the Pack-A-Wood handle, ran into its own share of detractors simply because one, it was made in China, and number two, the SK-5 and the plastic Pack-A-Wood handle were all considered subpar, even though it made a fantastic Bowie knife relatively affordable, which at the time I believe was around $170 and even as low as $120 in the secondary market, or if you found a really good distributor. Mind you, this is a Cold Steel Laredo pre-GSM. One would think that by showcasing the very upscale Cold Steel Laredo in the CPM 3V, one would think that this would be a very simple apples to apples comparison as it relates to overall design, and that the only prime differentiator really are the materials being used. I want to use this opportunity to share with my subscribers how even a knife of the same model and design can have, depending on the year, depending on what materials are being used, makes that knife very different when you compare it to what the previous models were. The reason why I want to point this out to you is because as a practitioner, you're going to notice these differences. Collectors maybe not so much because they're thinking in terms of materials, and their measure of performance is going to be based around philosophy of use as it relates to hard use, which is more woodcraft and bushcraft. As you know, in the Rolando Estacada channel and method, we have a very different perspective on the philosophy of use, meaning how does the blade maneuver in our hands for one, just in case we happen to need it for personal combative purposes, but for the most part, how it provides optimal blade design for repetitive use so that we become more proficient in our art, but also provides us some health benefits as it relates to multiplanar global integration of movements throughout the entire anatomy. This is why being very particular about knife design and knife materials is important to us as far as the Rolando Estacada method is concerned. First thing that I want us to take a look at is the handle design. In the early iterations of the Cold Steel Laredo pre-GSM, especially when we were looking at the SK-5 versions, what I actually found, since I am the owner of not just one, not just two, but three Cold Steel Laredos, one thing that I found, each handle had different dimensions. This one is actually a bit thicker and handles more thickly. This one is a little narrower and actually narrows all the way down here. So this one is a little thicker, this one is a little thinner, and just when you think that, well, maybe this one is just right, this one actually twists a certain way. It's so subtle, but having spent enough time doing reps with all three, when you do about 1,000 reps on each side, you start to notice these things. So one thing that I've noticed with them is that you have all of these handle variations, even if it's the same model. Now, if we take a look at the Cold Steel CPM 3V post GSM, the handle design, although made of better materials, has sharper angles in terms of its termination. So it's hard to tell, but the angle drops off very sharply and severely here. If we were to take a look at the Pack-A-Wood version, it doesn't actually terminate sharply. It actually does so in a somewhat rounded way. In my practice and movement with this actually takes care of a very interesting feature of moving with buoys, especially when you're moving with it in high speeds. When you move with a buoy in a very high speed, it sometimes, in very, very microgranular ways, it tends to move. But if the handle has rounded angular terminations, it doesn't give you negative space. And that negative space is very important for us to not have, because anytime there is contact between the skin and the handle, the nervous system has a way of calibrating the next move because it knows where it is. Think of the nervous system as a kind of GPS for handling knives, so that for as long as there is contact with the handle of the knife, the nervous system is a total go. That said, the problem that I've found with the handle design is that because that angle terminates a little more sharply, it actually creates negative space in the hand. My friend who loaned this to me, he said, well, maybe you just have big hands. Maybe, it could be that. I don't want to let the Cold Steel Laredo and CPM 3V being a premium product that easily off the hook, because upon observation, that sharpened angle is actually what contributes to that negative space. So when I started moving with this and training this with him, and Harvey, I have to apologize to you for bringing this up, because I have to bring it up because it's for the benefit of the subscribers. And this is something that I mentioned also with the Cold Steel Natchez, and I attribute it to negative space. Harvey is not new to Bowie back cuts. He actually does Bowie back cuts with a much heavier knife, the Fusion Battle Mistress from Bussy Knives. And I have him do this for reps after a bench session. So when he started to move around with this knife, something strange happened. He dropped it twice. But when I visited him recently, he said, let me borrow it so that I can just get a better sense of it. And upon my own exploration, it really comes down to that sharp angulation in the handle. Because of that sharp angulation, it feels a lot like the Natchez, meaning there's negative space. So even when I move with it, even I feel a little nervous about dropping it, simply because sometimes my nervous system just says, hey, I don't know what's going on here. Unlike the Natchez, where I mentioned in a previous video, when I start to move it in this position where the back cut terminates, I start to feel it in my thumb when I should be feeling it along my palm. I don't get that sensation when I'm doing this with the Cold Steel Laredo. It feels really fine. However, I don't know if it's the handle or the blade balance, but I'm kind of expecting it to press up into my palm. I'm not feeling that. I think, however, if the handle was a little thicker at the bottom, I would feel that press. However, because it is made narrower and now this is a little more angular, I don't get that neural feedback. There's a tendency to possibly drop it in high velocity environments. I don't find this to be the case with any of my Cold Steel Laredos, any of the three. And this one happens to be my favorite because when I do turn it this way, right about here, I'm laughing because I already feel it in my palm. But I think the reason for that is because since it rounds just enough, it fills my hand better. And so when I turn it this way, right about here, I'm feeling it along my tricep line. So right about here, it wants to extend and slash and possibly go into a reverso. That's what I love about the old school SK-5 Laredo, because it makes me want to flow far more easily because of that Paca wood handle that everybody hated. The other thing I do want to point out is how the handle likes to rest on the inside part of the palm for the thrust. That's one of the things I really like about the Cold Steel Laredo, because when I do a snap cut or a thrust, there's a secondary fulcrum along my thumb and index finger so that it tends to come up. And when this comes up, it has this beautiful alignment with the radial bone. So when I go ahead with the thrust, it's really nice and supported. For this one, I think it does a very good job. But again, because there's a lot of negative space, I feel some of that negative spacing here, and I can actually see some negative spacing on this side. Whereas I don't necessarily see this with the Paca wood SK-5 when I go ahead and do it this way, right about here. I can almost feel some friction coming up this way, and then it lands right here on that part of my palm. So it's really nicely nestled there. So when I thrust from here, it's really connected to my palm. Is there some negative space right about here? Yes, but it is augmented by the transfer into my thumb and index finger, which is kind of where we want the positioning of the hand to be when we are thrusting. This one, I think it does a pretty good job of that, but there's excessive amounts of negative space here. So right after here, kind of back cut that you're going to be throwing is from this position. Some practitioners may prefer that, but from my experience, especially when you are sparring, you don't necessarily want that kind of mechanism, because when I've done my sparring, it's with fencing masks. If you back cut into someone's fencing mask that way, it's not a good mechanic because you could lose the Bowie knife. You could disarm yourself. Well, it can be argued, well, by the time you backcut someone with a real Bowie knife, you don't have to worry about disarming yourself. This is true. But in real life scenarios, if you're using a Bowie knife, you're not going to be backcutting necessarily into someone's skull because that person may be holding an impact weapon, a lead pipe, a baseball bat. And what you don't want is when you backcut and they happen to block it with an impact weapon, you don't want to disarm yourself. You want to be able to hold that Bowie knife in what I've shared before, in that dragon's breath position, which comes from Japanese swordsmanship, where you hold it in this manner. The fingers are somewhat loose so that now it's being pressed into that palm, firing the tricep line so that after a snap cut or a thrust, you recollect it here and then back cut from here. And the fingers can be open if they want, but it's completely supported by your body's anatomy, specifically the tricep line and the oblique sling. So when you do this movement, it is supported by this very powerful grip that is supported by all types of muscular and myofascial lines. You don't necessarily get that with this version of the Cold Steel Laredo. The one combination where it will excel in, and I happen to like it a lot, is a combination that I don't necessarily show a lot of. And this happens to be the reverso to a horizontal snap cut. I don't like this combination because it encourages this kind of gripping where it's primarily from the index finger and thumb. However, it does occur in sparring. Completely legitimate and also effective. So the horizontal snap cut this way is something that I'd like to use, especially if the target happens to be the left arm of the opponent. Sometimes the sparring partner thinks that the only targeting is going to be along the right shoulder, anything along this line. But really, if you're sparring with somebody who's Bowie trained, there's a tendency to leave the left arm out. So in my own sparring, sometimes I will fake a back cut to the weapon hand and then horizontal snap cut to the left elbow if it happens to be in range. One of my favorite combinations is a back cut to the weapon hand, reverso to the high line, and then horizontal snap cut to the inner part of the left elbow. I happen to like this version of the Cold Steel Laredo for it because since it has that narrower profile, it tends to pivot better, where pivoting along the index finger and thumb actually optimizes that movement. I can also do it with the SK-5, and I can do it very smoothly. It doesn't give me the same kind of movement because once I do this reverso and I come around this way, there tends to be less space between these two, versus since this is narrower, there's more space, just a touch more space. So when I come along this way, it really snaps out. What I'm going to be doing is doing a movement comparison between these two, but the key takeaway that I want you to have is that the Bowie Knife Combatives curriculum is so rich that depending on the kind of Bowie knife that you have, you may end up having to optimize the kind of Bowie knife flow that you're going to be using with that knife, depending on the specific dimensions, weight distribution, and optimal biomechanics for that specific knife, even if that knife is technically within the same model class, and in this case, the Cold Steel Laredo in SK-5 Pakawood pre-GSM, and the Cold Steel Laredo in CPM 3V post-GSM with this wonderful micarta handle. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share.
One thing I started to notice with the 3V when I was moving with it even very early on in this section of the episode, I found myself constantly having to re-grip it, which is something I've never had to do with any of my Bowies before. So this is very early in the episode, so the main thing I want you to focus on is not just how well it moves in my hand in the beginning of the episode, but as the episode moves on, especially with the high volume repetition that I do between the SK-5 and the 3V, which one makes me better and which one eventually starts to hurt my hand. This is the combination I was talking about earlier with the highline reverso to the horizontal snap cut. Notice when I do this combination, I take my left leg back, That way I can change levels when I throw this combination because I'm relatively open when I throw it. This is my favorite combination for the 3V because of the narrowed profile of the handle. It allows me to use the secondary fulcrum of the index finger and thumb, so it moves very effortlessly in this particular combination. One of the things I really like about the Keating Bagwell methodology as it relates to the Bowie knife is that there is a tremendous focus on occupying center line, especially with back cuts, reversos, snap cuts, and thrusts. But with the unique profile of the 3V, it actually allows me to use this type of back cut with a back cut to the hand, then a reverso to the high line, then the snap cut to the inside elbow. But in order for me to do this effectively, I have to do something that I don't normally do, which is to go laterally. So not only do I change levels so that I'm lower, I take this lateral cut. That way, when I take over with this new kind of footwork, I'm completely offline. So when I throw these types of snap cuts, then I throw the combination, I go off laterally. This allows me to recalibrate myself with this new kind of footwork and this new position. This is one of the happy accidents of this thinner design profile of the handle because it actually forces me to throw this combination and try this new footwork. Now when we go to the SK-5, it's something that's really super fast and something that I'm very comfortable with, but because of the stoutness of that handle, it really fires the tricep line along my arms. I can stay in center position, throw the classical Keating Bagwell combinations, and not worry about having to re-grip, because if I re-grip, I can lose my timing. But I can still throw the combination I talked about earlier with the lateral stepping and taking care of that left arm and hitting that left elbow. One of the key critical differences I noticed with the 3V and the SK-5 is what the ergonomics happens to be with the Bowie once I go into a thrust. That handle design allows it so that it can practically bury itself into my palm. This is very different with the 3V because of how narrow it is. Notice how it allows my thumb to completely wrap around it, whereas the SK-5 doesn't need that. I can keep that space in my thumb because my palm is completely wrapped around it. As mentioned earlier, because of the narrow design of the 3V handle, it gives me this over-reliance on the thumb and the finger to secure it. The problem is when I run into a relatively solid target. So notice how I'm going ahead and thrusting into my coat rack Howard, and it starts to create this kind of instability along my wrists. Because of its narrowed profile and its forced over-reliance on the thumb and index finger, the handle easily slides up the palm when my hand opens. This is very different with SK-5 because of the stoutness of the handle. It actually runs flush into my palm. So notice when I thrust, my palm itself is preventing it from sliding up so that it actually lines up with my entire arm. So take a look at it again. When I thrust, it's flush into my palm. The 3V handle is so narrow that it slides up my palm. So this creates a lot of problems with the 3V versus the SK-5. The SK-5 is much easier to handle, even though the 3V moves similarly to it. So now I'm a little further into this episode, and one thing I want you to notice is that as I move with it, even though it's just like the SK-5 in terms of handling, it actually starts to bother my hand. It's hard to tell, but somewhere in this episode I actually look at my hand and I go, is everything okay? Because it's actually starting to make my right hand cramp up because of how narrow that handle is, and I only have so much purchase of it. I'm really only handling it with 2 fingers. So every time I run into Howard, it creates this instability, but it's not the case with the SK-5. Don't worry, buddy, I'm buying drinks tonight. Don't worry about anything. So when I go ahead and move with the SK-5, even though I'm probably about a good 15-20 minutes into my shooting of this episode, still moving with the SK-5 is very much a pleasure. It's something that I can feel very comfortable with because of how it allows me to use my entire palm and the entire myofascial line to support the movements. In fact, I'm going to try this thrust here, and when I thrust into this part of Howard, I'm actually going to try to lift it because of how well aligned it is. It actually feels like I could do it, but I also don't want to damage the blade. Don't worry, buddy, we gotta put you on a diet plan. Usually our criteria for what makes a good knife is if it feels comfortable, if it's something that can cut paper and actually do some hard use chores. But again, with the estacado method, I have a very different philosophy of use, which is the use of practice. You want to make sure that you pick a very well ergonomically designed handle and a well balanced blade. That way, when you put in those high volume repetitions, when you're doing 30, 60 minutes of practice, you're not creating any sort of high repetition stress injuries onto your wrist or onto your hands. So let's take a look at this snap cut drill that I happen to like. It looks a little silly, but what it is an isolation of the final part of the biomechanical sequence of the snap cut. So think of it as high level partials with the bench press. So you're only pushing on the last end, but you're putting in the high volume. That way you start to create the stress. And the stress is something that we're looking for to the overall system and movement, but not to the localized joint. So when I move with SK-5, even though it's high volume, high velocity, I don't feel this locally in the joint. I feel this systemically, and actually it feels really good because of the balance of the SK-5 and its relatively uncomplicated ergonomic design. It's very simple, it's effective, and it allows me to put the correct reps in. And right after I put in these reps, then I can release the tension that was built up in the myofascial lines by going into back cut flows. Just a few reps into the 3V, and man, I can feel that locally in my fingers, which is not what you want. So something I want to point out here is that although it is made of premium steel and it is priced accordingly, it is most likely designed for a philosophy of use that caters to more of the woodcraft and bushcraft people. However, if they're using it in a high repetition manner, I wonder how it's going to handle in their hands, considering that I am feeling stress in my hands and I'm just moving with it. Imagine what it might be like if they hit a hard target or start to chop through wood, and what that ergonomic design is going to feel like when that force transfer goes into their hands. This whole time I've been talking, I've been working with the SK-5 even after my right hand hurt, and despite that, I am flowing really well with the SK-5. The main thing I want us to take away from this is that even though something is made of premium steel and is priced as a premium product, we got to think of our tools, especially as Bowie combatives practitioners, from the perspective of optimizing our practice. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.